The question of who owns Scotland's cities, high streets, towns and cultural institutions is examined in the latest joint investigation by the Herald and the Ferret. The 5-day series is a result of months of investigative work and the fifth collaboration between the world's longest running national newspaper and the Investigative Journalism Cooperative. Who Owns Urban Scotland follows last year's award-winning collaboration, Who Runs Scotland, which saw the Herald and the Ferret jointly awarded Journalism Team of the Year at the 43rd Scottish Press Awards. First of all, we have Karen Goodwin, who's the co-editor of the Ferret. We've got Paul Dobson, who's one of the journalists there. And we have Ali Bryan, who is fact-checking lead at the Ferret. So firstly, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Gregor.
Karen, this series really has been a labour of love for you, and we've really kind of gained insight in the past couple of days as just at how much work has gone into it. But when the Herald asked you to investigate urban Scotland, what was the aim that you set out with? What did you aim to achieve with this series?
I think we were already really aware of how much work had been put into questions around who owns our rural land. So land campaigners like Andy Whiteman have done a phenomenal amount of work on that and really kind of patchworking together who owns those large estates and swathes of our country and why that matters and what we might want to do about that. But I think there's still lots of questions for people around who owns our cities and urban landscapes, and as you say, the infrastructure that connects all those cities to the rest of the country and keeps them moving. So we wanted to look at some of the things that would affect people's daily lives when they were living and using cities, but we also wanted to really unpick the fabric of the city's culture and look at the big cultural venues, the nightlife, arts, all of that sort of stuff. But we didn't want it just to be doom laden either. We also wanted to look at what some of the solutions were and what some of the work that was going on to address some of these thorny issues was. There's lots more in there that we've begun to have a little look at, and lots more that could come in follow-ups, but those are the main areas that this week we'll focus on.
I mentioned just before we came on here there, you can see the work that has gone into this. I mean, can you give us an idea of the scale of this collaboration? Just how many streets, cities, properties did you investigate over the course, and how long did it take you as well?
There was quite a big scope. We started out with the data, I suppose, and we looked at, I think the total in that database was almost about 68,000 properties across Scotland. So there was quite a lot to work with. From there, we narrowed down, we started looking at the high streets and main shopping streets on the 8 Scottish cities. So I think we looked at over 3,000 properties just on those main thoroughfares in Scottish cities, and we looked at about almost 9,000 vacant properties as well. So there was quite a lot of manipulation to do, and that was kind of the starting point of that was the Scottish Assessors Association database. From there, I guess there's lots more work to do in terms of just making sure that information is accurate. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes those are just the names of the property manager or an intermediary or a company who you need to follow the trail of further. We pulled various title deeds to check ownership. Sometimes those were out of date too, so we had to go full circle and check another way around. Sometimes we'd come up with conflicting information and have to just dig a bit further again. So yeah, it's been lots of learning, lots of work. Paul maybe wants to say more about some of the cultural venues as well that you looked at.
Yeah, so I think, Karen and Petra and Jamie, who worked specifically on the high streets and the vacant properties and stuff, they probably worked in a slightly more scientific way from myself. They, a lot of high level data and drilling down into title deeds and stuff like that. Whereas I suppose with cultural venues are a bit more dispersed and you're not always looking at the same places. And the other thing is that, most people can name the cultural venues that are important to them. So, so it was more just sort of, trying to speak to people in different parts of Scotland and different cities and just saying like, what cultural venues are you interested in knowing the ownership of? And then essentially the same process, looking at trying to get title deeds or looking at companies' house accounts, to see where these what can be quite complex ownership structures end up, because they're not always in Scotland, as I'm sure you're aware if you've read any of the series.
When people read the final result, they maybe don't have that kind of insight into the perseverance, the number of dead ends that you hit, the amount of time that an investigation like this takes as well. Because as you mentioned, things can be a bit opaque. You can be struggling to find the exact people behind these things.
That's part of it, isn't it? I suppose that's why we don't know, is that people are trying not to be found in some cases, and that's why they hide in these sort of opaque, financially secretive arrangements or partnerships or whatever it is. And as you say, it's not something that can be done overnight, and it does require like an investigative team like the Ferrets, I think, to get to the bottom of these things, where we've got a bit more time to do things with this kind of scope.
To put it in simple terms, why is this important? You see sometimes there's been a shift in perception among some members of the public. You hear, wrongdoing gets uncovered, and you often hear people step forward and say, "Oh, why does this matter?" So, why does it really matter when our high streets and these properties are owned by foreign-based companies?
A lot of us spend a lot of our time in urban areas, but we don't know that much about who owns them and who's behind them. I mean, high street shopping centres, venues, pubs. When you're going shopping or you're going out for a drink or you go for a meal, you go to a show, you don't really know, very little about who's making money from that, where that money is going. And then think about the infrastructure that underpins all these things like which we talked about in this series. So like broadband, airports, things like that, things that affect our day-to-day lives, but we don't know that much about the details of them. I think particularly with infrastructure, a lot of people just have an assumption that all this stuff is just sort of sorted out by the government, but there's loads of really interesting ownership structures and companies and firms that are behind these sort of things. But I think also with reference to after the pandemic, a lot of areas of business in cities and towns are really struggling, and we want to find out where's the money going, who's taking the money from high streets. And with regard to vacant land, I mean, there's a housing crisis in Scotland, and there's loads of land that's lying vacant or properties that are boarded up, etc. Is this justifiable? These are the sort of questions we wanted to ask. And again, regarding our cultural venues, as Paul talked about before, how safe are they from being sold off to developers? Or, if they are owned by people that have no connection to the city they're in or to the cultural life of that city, then how safe are they from being sold off to the developers and kind of leaving our cultural spaces?
That does kind of lead into the next question I was going to ask. We hear a lot this phrase that's commonly used about the death of the high street. We've seen, certainly in my own native Glasgow, the impact of recent years where you see more and more swathes of streets, Sauchiehog Street being one that's identified in the series is being boarded up. Do you think that when our urban areas are owned this way, that it is actually contributing to this problem, to the death of the high street?
There's obviously a lot of factors here, and we're looking at a massive change in terms of how we think about retail. And so even pre-pandemic, we had the rise of online shopping was going to change our high street, and there was already city strategies in place to deal with that. And then that's obviously turbocharged really by the combination of the pandemic and all the pressures there, and also by the cost of living crisis. So we do have a definite crisis for our high streets that's not necessarily just driven by ownership. But ownership then becomes really, really important at this time, I think. And you start to see the different ways in which ownership in the high street impacts. So one of the things that we've spoken to experts about is the way that some of the bigger banks and investment companies have maybe moved out of a lot of the high streets, such as Sauchiehall Street, which you mentioned, and some of the smaller ones, Reform Street in Dundee, for example. And what you get then is a patchwork of ownership. And a lot of those are kind of held up by mortgages. So whereas they would have been kind of owned outright and the owners could have invested in them and, improved them and taken care of them, often you'll no longer have asset managers. You'll have very absent landlords, companies who are registered in tax havens, who are not maybe putting in the repairs, who are not looking at, the best needs of that community or that street. So you've got, really a sort of very desperate type of ownership, which then is just not leading to a kind of cohesive whole. It makes it very difficult to have influence over things like master plans that the city might want to roll out. So absolutely, that ownership is fundamental, I think, to some of the problems that we're facing. And then you've also got, on your main streets like Buchanan Street, we saw that up to 40% of those were held in tax havens. So you've got people taking quite a lot of profit out. And I guess the other reason why that matters is if you do have vacancies, that's not only a sort of social cost in terms of people feeling a bit down about their city centre and how that looks and that emotional impact it has. There's also a very kind of direct hit on the councils who are already absolutely strapped for cash, and they're not able to collect those business rates if that lies empty for too long. So this stuff really matters. It matters to our lives in so many different ways. And I think that's what's been fascinating for us about it. It's not just digging into data, it's finding out how this might impact on you and your granny and your kids and, everyone in between.
Also the venues that we really love, so often you see a public reaction when the time arrives for the petition to get sent around saying, please save this place. And by that point, it's sometimes moved beyond the point of no return at that stage. I mean, you touched on it there just a moment ago. This is the ownership of these buildings ultimately has a deep effect on local communities, so on how people feel about their city, whether people feel positive coming into the town, and ultimately what we have to go out and do and enjoy in our spare time as well. Is that it's really have you seen the emotional reaction from people to the series as well, that you feel like you're actually addressing a problem here in a subject that really matters?
When you're talking about ownership, what you're really talking about is control. And it's the feeling that people have that they don't have any control about what their local community looks like or what their local high street looks like or anything like that. I mean, I think that's, that must be, devastating for people who've lived there for a long time and feel like it's gone downhill, but they don't know who to blame for that, or they don't know who to speak to about that, or how they can change that and turn that around. And that's the sort of impact of these essentially absentee or sort of anonymous ownership structures have. And then when you're talking about things like venues and culture and stuff like that, the other thing is that it can begin to seep into the actual product that these things are producing. That's what we've heard quite widely across the board, is like, particularly in culture. So you might go and see a show that has been extremely successful somewhere else, but doesn't necessarily have any sort of roots in Scottish culture or, the Scottish arts scene. But because it's profitable and because it's going to attract ticket sales, that's what they want to push forward. So I suppose, it can have that quite caustic effect on the whole sort of cultural landscape as well.
There was a great line in the piece talking about this sort of homogenised, there would be, you see it with certain bands playing at certain associated venues at gigs, there'll be a set size of venue for different types of bands, and people bring them into one of the three options. And then, we've seen, for example, in recent years, less bands going to places like the Barrowlands, for example, which is, widely regarded as one of Glasgow's great venues. People maybe don't realise that actual impact that this situation's having.
Get the joke about Transmit, which we reported on obviously in the piece, that they have Kasabian as a headliner every year. So I mean, that's sort of the highest level of what you've just talked about there, with the biggest music festival in Scotland. But it's indicative of the wider point, which is that you're going to start to get a flattening out and just people essentially booking people that they think are going to sell tickets, and that makes it very difficult for new artists and things like that to actually break through and to challenge sort of the cultural landscape as well, as it's set at the moment.
We've talked a lot in this conversation about the kind of the big icons and the cultural icons and the big kind of high streets, but we also looked right across the cities, and something I found really interesting was speaking to people out in kind of more local communities across the cities who'd maybe opted for various models of community ownership. And we were talking there about control. It was really interesting to see the way that communities had come together around a building that was owned in this way, in this different model, and how it made it more possible for them to be more responsive to their communities. So places that, for example, were owned by community groups didn't necessarily shut in quite the same way during the pandemic. They maybe continued some kind of outreach stuff. They were able to get in and maybe make up food parcels or hot meals for people. Once the restrictions had lifted, they were able to get in quicker. They were able to start offering the types of groups and supports that people needed. And so there was a kind of just, we talk that was allowed to happen through the Community Empowerment Act. And there was a real sense of empowerment for these communities that they could, take that on. comes with its its own problems, of course, as well. They're also responsible for roof repairs and having to kind of keep that building going, and so there's a tension between councils removing services and communities having to take that over. But I think that was another interesting kind of model of ownership that we looked at in the series.
You've touched on something there as well that, again, I'll draw on experience here in my native city of Glasgow, but the series itself really looks at similar situations in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, Dundee, right across Scotland. But we in Glasgow have seen the benefits that have come from community projects in certain areas. You've seen how, for example, the Finnieston area and that Clydeside area has really boomed over the past decade, and that was initially powered, or partly powered, by people who'd left, for example, the West End of the city. They could no longer afford there. They took their artistic community projects into a different part, and you see things grow around it. But is it as simple as that? Is there more of a benefit in some cases where, with big companies moving in, is there an added value that they maybe bring that we don't automatically recognise because it's not got that personal link?
There's lots to unpick there. I think when I was looking at speaking to some of the academics from Glasgow University who've been looking at, for example, how we fix the problems of our high street, and been working on a big research project over a 3-year period on some of this stuff with Sheffield University as well. They were talking a lot about that tension between bringing in investment, so that's private companies, and that brings with it some of this stuff with private ownership that maybe we're critiquing in some of the rest of the series, and how important it was to get that investment, but that investment isn't going to be made equally across the city. So your more deprived areas you're going to have that kind of widening of that gap in terms of the cities. So I think you can't just leave it to the market. There's got to be also all levels of government, UK, Scottish and local, putting their money where their mouth is and actually investing in our cities and its infrastructure as well, if we want to make life good and fair and equitable for everyone living here.
In your experience, what needs to change, whether it's at UK government level or at Scottish government, even at local level? Were there fixes that were identified during the course of this investigation?
First of all, in terms of the tax haven stuff, and Paul, I'm sure you would have found this as well, but a lot of the sort of Scottish government and SNP politicians that I spoke to were really adamant that it was a UK government issue, that they needed to tighten some of those loopholes around tax avoidance, that we needed much greater tax transparency across the UK. So I think that's one thing for the UK government. Other people would say the Scottish government have got a bigger part to play here too. There should be a lot more conditionality around some of the public money that goes into some of these kind of big projects, and that they're missing a trick by not doing more of that. And in terms of local government, there should be a lot more sort of coordination of master planning and really thinking through all the different kind of levels of that. So when you grant permission for an out-of-town shopping centre, what are the knock-on effects in the city centre, and has all of that been thought through in a round rather than just as individual projects? And that's challenging, but those are some of the things that certainly people spoke to me about. Don't know, maybe there'll be different ones for arts and culture, certainly.
Sort of similar response from Scottish government around, the UK government's responsibility for closing sort of tax avoidance loopholes and things like that. But I think the one that I heard, which was particularly interesting, was in the pub sector, which was around the planning system, and there being, loopholes in certain Scottish planning legislation where things like community pubs can be quite easily converted to other uses without much say for the local community. So I think, for example, freestanding pubs, they can be converted without the need for planning permission. If these are owned by disinterested investors abroad, then and they think, right, we're not making enough off this pub, but this is somebody's pub that they've gone to for 50 years, it's very easy for them to turn that into, shops or other uses that might be more profitable, might have far less impact or far less influence in the community. So yeah, I think that's probably the main one I heard in that sphere. And then otherwise it was to do with sort of more community ownership of venues and things like that when those opportunities arise.
Likewise, on the high street, there's lots of interesting things about kind of repurposing and reusing. A lot of chat about bringing more people into city centres, and traditionally, particularly in places like Edinburgh, we've really kind of like pushed local residents out of our city centres because that's the place where we can make money through retail and hotels and Airbnbs and all the rest of it. So really, a lot of the city strategies are about bringing people back into the city. But some of the academics that I spoke to also said to me, the problem with some of this stuff is it's still very developer led rather than thinking about communities. So where are the play parks and the schools and the doctors and the dentists and all of those things that make a neighborhood, which people really want to live in? So there's also kind of big questions about how do we develop a neighborhood. And people talk to me about cities that have done this well across the world, places like Vancouver, where they've got really good mechanisms to make sure that when they're developing these type of things, there's also money going in to developing local community plans. So some of the mechanisms need worked out there, I think, as well. It'll be interesting to see what happens around that sort of stuff.
Is there a will within government to actually make these changes? We've all had some painful lessons during recent months in the course of the pandemic. We've seen a bit of self-interest played out, certainly at Westminster, and some of the things that have been done there. It's hard to see where change is going to come, but do you think the will is there to actually change the system in this way?
The jury's out on that one. I think obviously these aren't new problems. A lot of the ones that we're reporting on, they've been sort of steadily worsening since maybe the 2008 financial crisis, so for a long time. And Westminster hasn't done a lot to tackle them, although obviously we have kind of only really had one government in that period of time, so you don't know what new government might do. And then obviously the Scottish government has made a lot of noise about the fact that they don't have the powers to clamp down on this kind of thing, particularly like the tax haven ownership and things like that. So obviously there is an alternative there. There's potentially independence. So it would be interesting to see if that's something they try to get to grips with if Scotland were to go independent in the future as well.
Whether or not there are kind of blocks in the road at the moment, this is the type of stuff that governments, whether at UK or Scottish or local levels, are going to have to reckon with, because if they don't, then the system isn't going to work. We've already talked about things like the kind of revenues that are lost, whether that's from business rates or by having large companies in tax havens. So all of this stuff is really essential for them to get to grips with. And I think within there, particularly local government, there'll be loads of people working there who really are committed to trying to do something about this. This is, particularly at the local level, they are City 2. I guess in terms of our democracy in Scotland, a lot of critics would say that we've got quite a devolved kind of democracy, and that actually that means that we're quite distant from the decision-making processes, and that actually one of the things that we need to do is get better at reforming so that we can have more connection with those decisions that are being made, and that might really help persuade our politicians not just to have the will but to actually take action.
It's an important point that readers should pick up on. This is an investigative series. You're trying to get to the root of the story, and the question is asked, who owns Urban Scotland? But you're not actively going out there to try and find solutions. But I will kind of put you in the spot with this one and ask: Did you encounter a model? Is there a model out there? Is there best practice, other cities that we could be or other countries or nations that we could be looking at and going, they are getting this right. They have found the right blend.
One thing that we looked at in terms of city centres was just how city centres could really change, and one organisation that's really pushing for a big change in terms of city centres is an organisation called Power to Change, and they are calling for a high street buyout fund to work with communities so that they can take ownership over part of their city centre, and really kind of find ways of taking those vacant spaces and putting them back into really good uses that work for the whole community. We've not seen much of that in Scotland yet. Some people will already be aware of what's been done in Dumfries in the mid-steeple quarter, and that basically was in Dumfries. The local people were fed up with these vacant buildings, the rundown high street, and they decided to take action. They looked into who owned some of the buildings, set up a community benefit fund called the Mid-Steeple Quarter, and they bought back 5 of the buildings, and one of those is becoming that's part of a £7 million refurbishment. There's going to be city or town centre flats and community businesses operating from that. I mean, they have also met roadblocks, and 3 of the vacant properties haven't sold up. So it's by no means a sort of magic bullet. And some of the other kind of experts would say the problem with big city centres, while that might be possible in a town centre, if you don't have a community to take over your city centre or to buy up things and be interested, then are you not kind of caught between a rock and a hard place? Power to Change also are calling for things like, compulsory purchase orders so that city councils could actually buy out and hold those for communities as they develop in city centres. So we could potentially maybe see not only community owned spaces running across our city centres, and whether that's community centres or other types of buildings, but also having those right in the heart of our cities. And that could really sort of fundamentally change things in terms of how people interact with their city, their flow put, and just also in terms of that ownership structure. I think that could be a really interesting kind of development that might take off.
This series features a lot of strong voices from people who are actually out there driving change in their community, people with a real bold ideas and real determination to make change in their communities. I mean, there is a will out there among people in Scotland, and there is also imagination and talent that wants to take ownership and do things within their communities.
I think the thing maybe I haven't touched on is that this series comes at a bit of a crossroads with all the sort of financial difficulties that businesses across Scotland and venues and pubs and everything are going to experience on the back of the pandemic, and with soaring energy prices and people just basically not buying, just not spending their money. And I think like that sort of enthusiasm is going to be vital if we're going to save some of these venues and businesses from just ending up in private hands where we basically exacerbate the problem that we've been reporting on in this story. So I think it's pretty important that the fight back starts here to some extent.
I think that's what we've been really struck by, is just how many people are kind of really struggling just now and fighting to save their businesses, and under incredible amounts of pressure. And so that kind of energy and drive is really impressive. Also met it in terms of kind of communities who've taken things into their own hands and who are, taking ownership over buildings that, haven't been reopened after the pandemic, for example, and sometimes facing huge barriers. I spoke to someone earlier in the week who, a community called Beetroot Arts, and it took them 5.5 years to go through all the legal loopholes and all the rest of it to buy their building. So, we're, at the moment, we're possibly not making it that easy for people. And I think one of the policy changes that could happen is thinking about how do we lower the bureaucracy for ordinary people, and maybe put in place a little bit more legislation for the big players who can cope with that, so that we try to level that playing field a bit more and make everything work for everybody, and just really honour that drive and enthusiasm and passion for making our cities all they can be.
Thanks so much for joining us, Karen, Paul and Ali, for this special podcast covering the series, which you're able to read in full at heraldscotland.com and at ferret.scot. Don't forget to go on there and subscribe, and also support our work and make sure that series like this are brought to the fore and that questions like this are answered. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us. Take care, and we'll see you soon.